University and former director here of the Cold War International History Project. I'm here in my capacity as editor of the Cold War Project book series, published by the Wilson Center Press and Stanford University Press, for a very happy occasion, which is the publication of Balazs Szalontai's Kim Il-sung in the Khrushchev Era, Soviet DPRK Relations and the Roots of North Korean Despotism, 1953 to 1964. Naturally, I heartily commend the book and its author to you, but let me just briefly say why. I've had the pleasure of knowing Balazs for several years in a variety of odd locales, including a yurt, actually Gur is the politically correct way to say it, in Mongolia now, just outside Ulaanbaatar, in Budapest, in various other Cold War locales, and have come to know him as an absolutely astonishing resource in terms of the growing field of international Cold War history. He's not only able to decipher Hungarian, which is in itself an accomplishment, but also English and many other languages relevant to Cold War history. And his book is an absolutely unique example of international comparative communist history that was utterly unthinkable before the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the opening of communist archives. Now, as you all probably know, North Korea is still not the most glasnost-filled place in the world. Nevertheless, Balazs has expertly used a variety of side doors and windows and wind chambers and other secret entrances to get inside the North Korean regime, the North Korean experience, and especially the North Korean role within the evolving communist world in the era of Nikita Khrushchev from 1953 and in the aftermath of Stalin's death until his ouster in October 1964. And his study is not only a fascinating exploration of North Korea's conduct as led by the respected, the great, the exalted leader, but also of the intra-communist struggle through the lens of the North Korean-Soviet relationship as it proceeded from the apogee of the unified, monolithic Sino-Soviet bloc as it was perceived from Washington to the era of the Sino-Soviet split and quite angry polemics between Beijing and Moscow in which the North Koreans played their own very careful, murky, mysterious game between their two very powerful communist neighbors. So it's absolutely fascinating as a work of history. Also, of course, it is not without interest to better understand the current North Korean regime in terms of U.S. relations and world relations with North Korea. And I think all of you who read this will find this book interesting in that respect too, because perhaps more than any other regime in the world, there is direct continuity between the Kim Il-sung era, the Cold War era, the deep Cold War era, even the Stalin era, and the regime we deal with today. And I think readers will find it interesting in a policy context. Our plan today is first to have Balazs speak, then two distinguished commentators who I'll introduce when he finishes. Just to further introduce Balazs, he's affiliated currently with the Department of Political Science at the National University of Mongolia. He has previously worked in Hungary. He received his PhD in history from Central European University in Budapest. And without further ado, I will hand the floor over to him.
Thank you so much, first for Jim, for this extremely flattering introduction, and second for all the people, ladies and gentlemen, who attended in this launching of the book. First of all, I would like to remark that it seems that the great leader has really achieved something after such efforts, because Jim is producing a really good example of creating a personality cult around someone. Only problem is he's not doing around the right person, who is here with that statue of 28 meters, but at least he's learning the method how to do it. So, well, what I would like to say first is to say thanks to all the people who helped writing and publishing this book. It is very difficult for me to make an order. Whom should I mention first and second and three? So I do it very rhapsodically, just the names come to my mind. So first of all, I would like to say thanks to all the publishers involved in it. First of all, Catherine Weathersby as head of the Korea Initiative project, also to Christian Osterman and Jim Hirschberg, whom I got to know, say, 6 years before, and who have consistently helped me in any kind of research I did with regard to North Korea and other countries. Also, I would like to say thanks to Joe Brinley, who was head of the publishing house, and all the people who struggled with editing the manuscript. And I must say this was a really hard struggle, both for them and for me. I cannot really imagine what sort of effect it would have had on the readers if they had seen the original version. No, anyway, so I would like to also say thanks to all the people who helped me in writing first the dissertation on which the book is based, and then the book itself, in writing and revising and rewriting the book. Because one important lesson which I learned is that if we want to do some research work really carefully, then we must listen to everybody who is expert in the field, not selecting them according to any kind of ideological, political or other preferences. We must have a kind of syncretistic approach, and we have to listen to everybody instead of concentrating on differences. So this is why I would like to mention just a few names who have helped me so much over the years. One of them is Bruce Cummings, who was, as I remember, the first who started to provide me with really good, detailed advice and responding very patiently to so many emails which I sent to him. I also would like to mention Andrei Lankov, who unfortunately is not here at the moment. He is in Seoul and he is one of the best experts on the Russian documents. So he also was patient enough to read the whole text when it was in dissertation form and commented on every sentence which had some problem. And also there were so many persons who helped me in that, whom I mentioned hopefully in a complete list in the acknowledgements of my book. So without their assistance, this book would have never been published. And finally, in addition to the experts, I would like to say thanks from here over the ocean to my parents who tolerated the fact that I have been involved in this work for so many years instead of doing some socially more useful job like a secondary school teacher or whatever, for which there is demand in Hungary. So anyway, now I would like to say a few words about the possible usefulness and relevance of this research. So what is possibly new in a scholarly sense, and what can be used in interpreting the actual situation? So speaking about first the more scholarly aspect, I would like to highlight just a few points of which I became aware during my research and which need certainly further study by others, as many persons as possible. One is that it seems that the dynamics of North Korean-Soviet relation had a dynamics of its own. It should not be regarded just a reflection of the great picture of Sino-Soviet relations. Previous works are often inclined to put the Soviet-North Korean relationship simply into the context of the Sino-Soviet rivalry and conflict. it seems that North Korea had its own policies and own concepts, and it was not just a maneuvering between the two big powers. For example, I would like to mention that the perceptible tension and conflict between the Soviet Union and North Korea appeared, at least according to the Hungarian documents, at least in 1954. That means 2 years before the 20th Congress and much before the open disagreements between the Soviet Union and China. And possibly there were some kind of disagreements already before, but this is what I could document it. Second important issue is that, which is related to the first, that it seems that for Kim Il-sung, the unification of Korea and in general the relationship between the two Koreas was more important than the relationship with the two big communist powers. So he could be rather pragmatic in dealing with these two big powers if this or that maneuver suited him in his efforts with regard to South Korea. So I mean, he had a Korea first policy and not a Soviet first or China first policy. He could be rather flexible in this sense. For example, I may mention the example that after Lee Sin-man was overthrown in the April Revolution, Kim Il-sung was rather pragmatic in accepting and approving Soviet proposals, which in that moment he found more convenient for his policy than any kind of idea that the Chinese might have had. Also, I would like to mention that usually scholarship is of the opinion, with some few exceptions, of whom I may mention the works of Haruki Wada and others, that the end of the Korean War was predominantly determined by the death of Stalin. What I found seems to indicate, not absolutely proved at the moment, but seems to indicate that serious preparations for ending the war started as late as the end of 1952. That means already under Stalin. It was not done very quickly, but I think the decision in general was made already that time. Then I also would like to mention that although it was really difficult to perceive and analyze the opinions and reactions of the North Korean population, because they had their very good reasons to keep quiet, particularly in the presence of foreigners. Still, there are indications that the regime never managed to brainwash the population, at least not much more than it was achieved in China under Mao or in the Soviet Union under Stalin. So even though people may have been more or less hermetically isolated from the outside world, still they understood that they are not living well. It was not difficult to see that. So even though political protests did not occur for very good reasons, but dissatisfaction did exist. And so the effect of political propaganda should not be overestimated. Although, as I must emphasize again, as long as the regime remained so strong and all-powerful, people were simply afraid of doing anything with the situation, but it was also clear that they felt that life should be better as it is. They did not necessarily, in most cases not, directed this criticism toward the top leadership. All of the indications which I found was that criticism was not directed against Kim Il-sung himself, with the exception of few people who by any chance knew him personally, and therefore they were aware of his limits as limits of his knowledge. But ordinary people either found it too risky to mention him or didn't think that it was him. But still, reactions to the problems were rather rational. No amount of brainwashing could conceal from people that life conditions are not good. And also I would like to mention that the factor of nationalism was extremely strong in North Korea all the time. So for this reason, it is rather misleading to consider the North Korean regime just a copy, an imitation of Soviet Stalinism. Of course, it was influenced by the Stalinist model, but I think the Chinese Maoist model was, if we speak about foreign models, much more important. And also, the factor of nationalism was strong enough to override any kind of foreign influence after the regime became politically independent enough. In fact, although people may be critical of this statement, I must say that one of the most important, not necessarily the most important reason of the extremely rigid and repressive character of this regime was the nationalist factor. Not directly, but at least indirectly. Because in all times in Sovietology, it was often believed or considered that if a communist regime is at least nationalist, then it will make it better. Well, after learning about Albania and Ceausescu's Romania, we are not necessarily inclined to accept this at face value, and it was true for North Korea as well. So this is what I would like to mention with regard to the more scholarly aspects of the research. And finally, as concluding remarks, I would like to make something which may help us in interpreting the actual situation. First of all, it seems that the North Korean leadership was very much accustomed to play along with big powers. When they were pressured to do some kind of economic corrections, they calculated that how much concessions they have to make, mostly superficial economic corrections, in order to get the assistance. And actually, it has been overlooked by most observers that how many times they did corrections in the 1950s and 60s. It was an really astonishing amount of occasions when they corrected this or that in their economic policy. But always these corrections remained rather superficial. So they understood that this is what they have to do in order to get the assistance, but they were certainly unwilling to go even further. Particularly unwilling they were to make concessions which could have undermined the stability and control of the regime. So in this sense, if the big powers tried to have a kind of cooperative approach toward North Korea, it usually had only limited results, because the North Korean regime was so suspicious of these foreign powers that no matter how friendly they behaved toward it, it could not convince them enough about the benefits of being more open. On the other hand, it is also clear from everything which I found that whenever the big partners, the big powers of the communist world tried to put pressure, even brutal pressure on North Korea, it did not work. maybe it worked on a very short time, on the short run, but on the long run it always became counterproductive. And the regime was rather good and effective in withstanding this pressure. So the idea that we can achieve substantial changes in the North Korean situation by really putting hard pressure on them politically, militarily, in any sense, I don't think it does work. So in a sense, it's a kind of deadlock, because neither a very concessionary cooperative approach is very effective, nor pressure is effective. In a sense, the problem is that North Korea is very much accustomed to dealing with states and governments. So that means that, for example, to be more concrete, if the United States is dealing with North Korea and would raise the issue of, say, human rights in North Korea, the North Koreans can really easily retaliate by becoming more uncooperative in other fields, like with regard to nuclear program or whatever. And because automatically in such a situation the human rights issue would come to the second or third or fourth place on the American foreign policy agenda. So in bilateral interstate relations, they always can have an opportunity for tit for tat. So in a sense, maybe the most effective way of influencing the internal policies of the regime, if there is any, is not done in intergovernmental relations, but by private organizations, say private donors or whatever, which are not in any way affiliated with governments. Because first of all, this makes the regime very suspicious of the whole activity, and second, they can retaliate. But if they lock out a private assistance aid organization, then what will happen? They cannot do anything to make problems for this organization just for themselves if they lock it out. And also I would like to mention that no matter how it looks like, but the North Koreans are rather good diplomats, in the sense that they are very calculating. They always know very well what they do. They may pretend that they are irrational. Actually, this is very effective tactic on their part, that they pretend to be irrational, but they are by no means that. They have rather long-term plans, and I must say that they often really succeeded in concealing their real intentions from the Soviet and East European diplomat. They had such complicated diplomatic operations which completely baffled and fooled the Soviets, who were simply not prepared for this kind of complicated tricks. So I think we should not concentrate too much on the language and rhetorics what the North Koreans use. We should be more concerned with what they do and carefully analyze it. And this is the reason why I tried to limit the references to North Korean ideological slogans to a necessary minimum in my book, because it is tempting and very easy to ridicule and criticize this kind of outrageous propaganda. But actually they themselves don't take it so seriously as they pretend. It's actually a very effective smokescreen to conceal what they have in mind. So I think we should treat North Korea more or less in the same way as Chinese or Soviet foreign policies were analyzed. And I think the best analogy to understand the foreign policies of the North Korean regime is actually Mao's China. They had very similar methods to influence for other countries, and I think we can learn the most about their methods if we look at what the Chinese did in the 1960s and 70s. Even the most provocative and seemingly most irrational actions of the North Koreans were usually based on careful planning. I never saw any case when they did something just accidentally. Usually they knew very well what they did. The only problem was that their idea was that if something was considered effective, then they never cared with the fact whether it's acceptable by international norms or not. But they certainly never did anything any kind of haphazard or not planned action. So in this sense, there was really a big difference between this regime and certain African dictatorships like Idi Amin of Uganda or Jean Bedel Bokassa of Central African Empire, who really could do things in a rather unexpected way, just because they had this idea and they suddenly changed course and then again switched back and forth like this, like a zigzag. North Koreans didn't do that. So I think if we want to understand them, that it's really should be done very carefully and not concentrating on rhetorics and ideology, because it is just a surface. So I personally really don't believe that the North Koreans ever intended to provoke a war with the United States. It's very interesting that even the most provocative actions they had, like, for example, the killing of 2 American officers in the DMZ in 1976, it was carefully calculated and used for propaganda purposes, as I could see. And for militaries, in a military sense, it was absolutely irrelevant. And always I think we should take into consideration when they do something, then they expect the other side to do some kind of reaction, and often this reaction is more important than what they actually do. So I don't really think that they want any kind of conflict which can be fatal for them. The only problem is that they also cannot really imagine how they can live in a mutually constructive and close relationship with other countries, with the possible exception of China and maybe South Korea. They simply don't have experience with that, and they don't really want to have it. They feel that any country which is stronger than them is a potential threat. They have some reason for thinking like that, but on a long run this is not constructive, because the only way to solve the problem is to make the Democratic People's Republic of Korea the strongest power on earth, which is a bit difficult to achieve and maybe wouldn't be welcomed by other countries. So I would like to finish my comments with this, and I am sorry for speaking more than the expected time.
Thank you, Bawash. That was actually right on time. Our first commentator is Professor Young-Ki Kim from Kyungnam University in Seoul. He's currently here at the Wilson Center as a public policy scholar, and I'm pleased he's also former Vice Minister of Unification in the Republic of Korea, and so I'm pleased to give him the floor for 10 minutes.
Yes. It's my honor to join this seminar as commentator. I would like to express my appreciation for Professor Balazs' exceptional work. I especially appreciate his effort in classifying and analyzing diplomatic documents in North Korean studies. Thanks to his efforts, we have not only unveiled the roots of North Korean despotism and the origin of North Korean regime, but have also clarified the internal and external political situation of North Korea during the Khrushchev era. Until recently, scholars and specialists have had to depend on conjecture frequently when studying North Korea because of the lack of access to relevant materials from Russia, China, and North Korea. However, Professor Barad's studies have been based not only on corroborative materials and documents, but also on newly declassified sources. This has helped us in gaining a systematic understanding of North Korean policies and behavior. His comparative analysis of North Korean foreign policy with those of China, Vietnam, and East European countries has given us a comprehensive understanding of the movements of communist countries during the heights of Cold War. As Professor Hirschberg has mentioned, this book has great value because it provides us with clues in interpreting and predict North Korean positions and behaviors. It helps us to answer such questions. How can we interpret the behaviors of North Korea today? Will North Korea remain the same or change in the future? What method should we use to induce North Korea to act the right way? So this book offers useful insights which is needed to policymakers. The past cannot be discounted easily. Just as Kim Jong-il has preserved his father's body from rotting to keep the elder Kim's spiritual legacy as the eternal leader of North Korea, we must always keep in mind the lessons learned from past dealing with the DPRK governments. It is also vital to remember North Korea's unique position in the 21st century as a lone, cult-based totalitarian political system. I'd like to summarize and explain the various aspects of the North Korean system as follows. First is the Juche ideology. This leading political ideology covers all aspects of North Korean policy and serves as rationales for continued despotism and totalitarianism. The core philosophy of Juche is one of self-reliance and independence in decision-making. That is, a person is his own master and makes his own decisions. But the North Korean interpretation has been narrowed to apply only to their leader. Both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il roles have been elevated to acting as the brain of the country with the North Korean people serving as voiceless, disposable limb. The development of Juche ideology has a close connection with the process of reinforcing totalitarian leadership. The North Korean leader always emphasized self-reliance, independence, and self-defense. Whenever he faced a political crisis, such as the death of Stalin, famine, successive political purges, and the Sino-Soviet rivalry. Juche ideology was nothing but integrated values opposite. We can see the totalitarian leadership of Kim Il-sung was completed when the North Korean Labor Party officially recognized Juche as the only political ideal in 1970. The second aspect of the North Korean system is secretiveness. Classification goes beyond the normal need to know compartmentalization, common even to democratic nations. Major events such as the Hungarian Revolution and the 20th Congress of CPSU Communist Party of the Soviet Union, not reported or distorted to fit government purpose. The flow of outside information is controlled and filtered, and actions of diplomatic officials are closely monitored. Third is duplicity. North Korean positions fluctuate easily depending on the strategic situation. North Korean propaganda shows the discrepancy between government assurance and actual intent. While North Korea is violently anti-Japanese on one hand, it has pursued improved relations with Japan when convenient. While Kim condemned Khrushchev de-Stalinization as revisionist, he never hesitated to ask for help from the Soviet Union. The DPRK has also suggested the Federation Unification method and shown an outwardly peaceful attitude towards South Korea that was followed by its fortified military power before long. North Korea's duplicity has confused its counterparts. I will add explanation when I talk about North Korea's nationalism. Fourth is self-centered. North Korea is not willing to understand the standpoint of its counterpart and intentionally despise reciprocity or mutuality. Although North Korea had received assistance from communist countries, it took this aid for granted based on fraternity. And if it were possible, North Korea tried to avoid offering the fact to the public and turn the subject to another without the expression of appreciation for such donation. Fifth is inactive and submissive role of the North Korean people. The North Korean way of life is based on absolute obedience, so that it drains the North Koreans' creativity. This is the result of half century of government surveillance, intimidation, mobilization, and brainwashing. Professor Bala's book explains these characteristics in detail. The author mentioned the paradox posed by Kim's opposition to de-Stalinism in the face of increasing efforts to lessen dependence on the Soviet system. And he tried to impart a message that it was Kim's strong nationalism that enabled the DPRK to pursue political independence and economic autarky through coordinated posture, despite the tension between the DPRK and the Bretton communist countries. However, it is contradictory to pursue communism and nationalism simultaneously. As North Korea expressed, communism, because it is an international ideology, has a goal to destroy nationalism by coordinating with international workers. Kim Il-sung tactically used these mutually exclusive values as fits his needs. Purge or autarky was not a means to accomplish nationalism, but a mere result of struggles toward despotism. Juche ideology has been established only to justify the evasion of political liberalization. North Korea's strategic goal has always been regime stability, and in that context, North Korea can accept neither political liberalization nor economic reform in fear of upending the regime's stability. Thus, I do not agree with the view that North Korea has been put the same amount of emphasis on totalitarian enforcement and economic reform and flexible to prioritize between the two according to the situation, whether economic reform has always been below in the rank. When we examine the measures taken by North Korea, we see that North Korean policies in the era focused on one thing. Nationalism was just a cover-up. Internally, the North Korean leader purged his political competitors one by one. He attributed the failure of North Korean politics to his subordinates, if necessary, criticized bureaucracy, and pretended to show generosity to the North Korean public. Externally, North Korea used the leverage to get assistance from the Soviet Union, sometimes by not obeying Khrushchev and sometimes by following Soviet leadership. In the conflict between Soviet and China, North Korea attempted to get an appeasement policy from both countries. It was not because of North Korea's isolationism and cultural nationalism that North Korea remained neutral between the Soviet Union and China. North Korea has believed that it can easily, with a face-saving, bargain with other countries for what they want to, by doing or by threatening to do what the countries oppose. North Korea is now repeating with the U.S. What it did with the Soviet Union and China. Why did North Korea focus on heavy industry? The author explains simply that the reason was economic independence, but I'd like to add other reasons, such as North Korea's intention to take initiative to compete with South Korea militarily, its desire to follow the advanced East European countries' development model, and the effective labor management in North Korea. If North Korea intended to pursue autarky in the true sense, it should have focused on light industry as well as heavy industry. When North Korea demanded the withdrawal of Soviet and Chinese military troops, I don't think that it was because of nationalism. Rather, I think it was a tactic to press for the withdrawal of U.S. military troops from South Korea. They also pointed out that North Korea had carried out preliminary action before it made any significant policy changes. Yes, one of these preliminary actions was the withdrawal of Soviet troops in 1948 in preparation for the Korean War in 1950. I'd like to ask the following question. Was the withdrawal of Chinese troops in 1958 another example of preliminary action? If so, what was it for? Here, we should keep in mind that the Soviet Union and China are located in close proximity to North Korea, while the U.S. is far away. The author analyzed that the North Korea's peaceful gesture toward South Korea partially results from the anticipation of economic benefit. In other words, North Korea wanted to have South Korea as its market for the industrial goods of low quality. This is a very interesting analysis because it could have taken place if the international environment of the 1960s had not changed to press North Korea to fortify military power. Professor Balazs says there should be more study on Soviet Union's behavior that passed over North Korean totalitarianism and Kim Il-sung's personality cult. even when it did not like it. It cannot be explained by one reason, such as the Soviet Union had focused more on the East European countries than on North Korea. I think the Soviet Union considers other factors. For example, the Soviet Union felt pressure when Ambassador Ivanov intervened in the anti-Kim movement in 1956. Now, also, the Soviet Union wanted dignity as a leading country of communism and restrain the Chinese influence on North Korea. More practically, the Soviet Union didn't want to hurt its economic benefits. Lastly, I'd like to explain the North Korean behavior today in terms of North Korea's special character in its system, which is based on the duality and pay saving. But I will wait my next turn. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
It's time.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Our next commentator is Catherine Weathersby. Catherine should be familiar to many of you from her many publications on the Korean War, especially using newly available Russian documents. Some of her articles have appeared, of course, in the Cold War Project Bulletin and working papers. And parenthetically, I should mention that one of the appeals of Balázs's book is that there have been many excellent new studies by Catherine and others, such as Chun Zhen and Xu Guangzhang, on new communist evidence on the Korean War. But Balázs is really the first scholar to take a comparably in-depth look at the succeeding period of the decade after the Korean War. And so I think this will be particularly interesting to Cold War scholars who have looked at the war, but not very much at the post-war period. Catherine is presently here at the Wilson Center as director of the North Korea International Documentation Project, and I will hand the floor over to her.
Thank you. This is just such a happy occasion for me. I can't remember exactly when it was, but sometime in the late 90s, I was at the Foreign Ministry Archive, the Party Archive in Moscow, and happened to run into Al Reber, who used to be at University of Pennsylvania, a professor of history. And I chatted and told him what I was doing, and he said, I have a... He was then teaching at Central European University, chairing the department there. And I have a really talented grad student who's doing research on North Korea and the Hungarian sources. I said, really? Yeah, give me his name. So that was the beginning of a very long email correspondence that I should issue all of you fair warning if you undertake email correspondence with Balázs. It's a serious commitment, right? Through the voluminous correspondence we've had, I have learned a great deal about North Korea, but also about the entire communist camp. I think, first most original and distinctive characterization or quality of this book is the extraordinarily revealing picture it provides of life within the communist camp. I mean, not just in North Korea. After all, he's looking at North Korea through the side door of reports from Hungarians. And so, but what we see is the Hungarians not only talking about North Korea, but the Hungarians talking to the Soviets about what the North Koreans are doing, or the Hungarians talking to the East Germans and the Czechs about what the Soviets think the North Koreans should be doing or should not be doing. It's this amazing inside view of the complexity of relations within the communist camp. It becomes clear that within that world, everything was everybody else's business. Right? Lots of things, economic policy, he focuses a lot on that, not to mention political policy, but economic policy had a doctrinal quality, it was central to the religion. And therefore, it was important that everybody in this worldwide religious movement if to use that analogy, be doctrinally faithful. And so there's a lot of discussion, a lot of monitoring of what each party within the communist world is doing, each government is doing. That's really terribly interesting, I think, for us as historians, just to understand better, what was going on in the communist world all these decades, and to understand better their current approach to relations with other states. But it's also really a goldmine, of course, for historians, that they were all taking care of each other's business, because it means that we can enter the system in any one point, through the Czech sources, the Albanian sources, the Russian sources, the Chinese sources, and get a great deal of information about the whole picture. And that is what Balázs has done in a pioneering and really groundbreaking way. I highly commend this book to all of you. There are a number of other people attempting to do similar things and have already begun doing similar things, working on North Korean history through Polish sources, Albanian, East German, Mongolian, Czech, as well as Russian, of course, and Chinese. Balázs, I think, sets really a high standard for this whole new wave of scholarship. It's a high standard, first of all, in its breadth, and I don't quite know that anyone is going to match the breadth that he brings to this, because he compares what's happening in North Korea with the most remarkable range of countries. North Vietnam, Albania, Cuba, the other more advanced countries of the communist camp, but also other countries that were authoritarian. You get comparisons to Uruguay, to all kinds of places. I mean, really, really very illuminating. It's a very, very broad view. It's also a deep view because he is looking at domestic politics, at economics, at culture, at foreign relations, all of these levels simultaneously. I find that, personally speaking, quite difficult to do. It's much easier to focus on one tier because it's just more coherent to do that. To really integrate all of these tiers is quite a challenge, and he does that, I think, really extremely well. That leads to what is perhaps, in terms of substance, the greatest contribution, which is a contribution to the question of causation. His main question is why. It's not so much what or who or when, although that figures in the story, but it's primarily why. Why did North Korea take a path that was so different from that of all of the other countries within the Soviet bloc? And unfortunately for our normal psychological tendency to want simple answers, he makes it impossible for us to answer that in a simple way. He relentlessly undermines every sort of linear explanation we might give for this phenomenon. Linear meaning, well, we start with Korean tradition and then there's a straight line to North Korean despotism. All right, shows, yes, that played some role, but many other things were involved. Or we start with the effects of the division of the country and go forward. Or we start with the Cold War context, or the personal qualities of the leader, or any other thing that might be mentioned, legacy of Japanese colonialism. There are perhaps more, on the other hands in this book than in most. Because I think what he is doing really very brilliantly is showing that it was not only a combination of local and external circumstances that were shaping the particular course North Korea took, but that these constellations of circumstances were not fixed, right? They were constantly shifting, right? And so the story was very far from being predetermined. If there had been a change in one of those circumstances, this really big kind of hologram, right, that's being created, then it could have propelled, the trajectory of the national development in a slightly different way. You had all kinds of things that could possibly have made a difference at many different points. For present policy, I think if we think of the development of the country in this way, it has a couple of implications. First, it's a rather hopeful way of thinking about North Korea, because it sort of eliminates this very simplistic notion that the only way to bring about significant change is through a complete change in the leadership or a change in the system, right? It suggests that there are all kinds of other factors that conceivably can push the story in a different direction. If that is then the case, and I think he certainly is quite persuasive in arguing it was the case in this historical period, then that makes the task of crafting policy more demanding, because all sorts of different factors, even some that we might not think at the time are particularly influential, can perhaps end up having really quite significant influence. Now, my last comment is that in reading this book, I'm struck by how amazingly successful Kim Il-sung was. It's really quite remarkable what he survived and his amazing ability to navigate a perilous, set of circumstances and maintain his rule, maintain the autonomy of his country, maintain the survival of his country. It really is quite remarkable. And that may, I think, today be useful to keep in mind by way of explaining how very strong the delusion has been within the leadership of North Korea that they could keep this game going, They've been successful for such a long time. So there's a natural sense, a natural tendency to believe they can keep it up, So I just offer that as a suggestion for one of the many kinds of insights that one can gain from reading this very dense and very original historical study. I'll end with a question to Balázs. He very provocatively said that there was a rationale behind the axe murders of 1976 at the DMZ. So now is the time. Tell us what that rationale was.
Thank you, Catherine. Why don't we have a quick answer to that, and then I want to open the floor to discussion.
Well, I must say that if we eliminate the factor of moral implications, then it had a rationality. That means, to put in a short way, the North Koreans wanted to demonstrate to the whole world that the United States is an aggressive power and creates problems in Korea. They kept telling this to the Soviets for a long time. The Soviets simply did not believe it for good reason. And then they told it to the Chinese reacted in the same way. So, in a sense, the North Koreans forced the United States to demonstrate its military might in South Korea, and this is precisely what the United States did. So, to put it in a blunt way, the American leaders, Henry Kissinger and others, they believed that by this demonstration of military power, by rushing, aircraft carriers and other sorts of forces, B-52 bombers to Korea, they forced Kim Il-sung to back up. to put it cynically, they actually did exactly what Kim Il-sung wanted them to do. Because for the North Koreans, it was not a good thing that if the Americans behaved in a passive way. They wanted international attention drawn to the Korean issue. And so they actually provoked the United States in a way which was short of provoking a war, but enough to make the United States react in a rather threatening way. So if we eliminate the factor that it was morally absolutely wrong to commit such murders, it had a kind of rationality, but on the surface, because one general weakness of the North Korean regime was and is that they simply don't realize that something can have an opposite effect. So I mean that people will look not only at the fact that the United States is demonstrating military power, they will maybe also critical of the fact that 2 people were killed by Axis. So I just want to reply very shortly to one of your observations, that to put it very shortly, I don't think that the withdrawal of Soviet troops was a prelude in itself to the Korean War. It is true that it was also motivated by the idea of getting the Americans out of South Korea. But Catherine demonstrated very convincingly that it took a very long time for Kim Il-sung to convince Stalin that the war should be launched. So it was made only long after the withdrawal of Soviet troops. So I disagree with that a bit. And the other thing is, with which I disagreed this time very strongly, is Jim's observation that I was the first person to pay this attention to this post-Korean War era. Actually, it was Andrei Lankov who started to very good research on the 1950s, on 55, 56, and I was very much inspired by his research.
But you went deeper. In any case, let me open the floor, and I will leave for possible future discussion whether Balázs would offer a similar interpretation to the seizure of the Pueblo in 1968 and the shooting down of an American plane in early 1969, and also commend to you regarding the Pueblo incident a recent working paper of the Cold War Project by Sergei Radchenko, who uses very interesting Soviet documentation on Soviet-North Korean interactions during the Pueblo crisis. But let's kick off the questions. And please identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
Will Amatruda Catholic University. A former director of the CIA has commented that North Korea is the CIA's largest single intelligence failure, that they've never been able to infiltrate an agent, they've never been able to co-opt anyone in North Korea itself. And part of the intense interest in your book is that you give us an inside view from people who were there, albeit foreigners. My question is in 2 parts. First, and excuse me if I'm plowing over ground you've already covered in this session. First, how much access did the East Bloc diplomats have to North Korea? Were they all stuck in some kind of gilded ghetto in Pyongyang? Did they get a chance to travel? Who did they get to speak to? In other words, how trustworthy are their observations and how astute? And second, the converse of that, from the evidence you looked at, what was the impression of the Hungarian diplomats and other East Bloc diplomats that they spoke to as to how realistic a picture did the North Koreans have of the outside world, the greater communist world and the non-communist world?
Excellent questions. Balázs?
So, to the first question, I would like to say that the diplomats were indeed isolated from North Korean environment, more and more isolated. by the time already in the 1960s and 70s, it was very strict in any sense. But at the same time, we must take another factor into consideration, that sometimes the diplomats did not understand or recognize something, but they noticed it. So we can maybe on some occasions interpret their observations in a more perceiving way than themselves they could that time, because simply they had to react very quickly to some event. They hadn't had the foresight or hindsight. So in a sense, the North Koreans were relatively predictable, in the sense that the system was so centralized and top-down that even the smallest event could have a kind of importance in some sense. Nothing happened, or almost nothing happened accidentally. Even if there was a kind of seemingly low-level conflict of a growing hostility or whatever, then you could always think that this is somehow related to some top-level decision. So in this sense, it was easier to find out the logic of North Korean policies than what may happen in a much less centralized political system, when if someone is done, then maybe it was not approved or initiated by the government. And the second issue, well, it is again the first, related to the first, because the North Korean leaders were increasingly distrustful of these diplomats. So if it was about foreign policy, they became increasingly reluctant to tell them the, how can I say, real evaluation they had about such international situation. Usually it was through not in high-level discussions when Kim Il-sung or the foreign minister himself met some Hungarian party leader, when they mentioned it. Usually in such occasions, they said just propaganda slogans about aggressive imperialist United States. So you have to go into some other conversations to see. And I must say that they had a rather reasonable understanding of both the South Korean situation and American policies. They just were very reluctant to show that they understand this, particularly because it was not good for them to tell their allies that the other side was not necessarily as aggressive as they presented. But I think they understood it very well. Actually, this was one of their greatest power, that they could understand the other side better than the other side could understand them. And they still use it very effectively.
Okay. Identify yourself, please.
My name is Meredith Cummings at the University of Michigan. When I was reading your book, I was thinking we all see through glass darkly. We only know in part. And to know in part through the eyes of the Hungarian diplomats, for me, was very fascinating. And I thought you did a very good job explaining the limits of that kind of observations as well as opportunities, as you did today, actually. But I was wondering, in your dark nights of the soul, sometimes when you think about actually the problems posed by documents, what do you think are maybe some of the things that you overly highlighted as the result of your reliance on this particular set of documents, and what were the kind of things that you probably would have highlighted if you had maybe, this is a hypothetical question, documents that were available from other areas? So that would be my first question. And the second one is something like this. The great strength of your book is your comparative insight. And I think what you do very well is to take what appears to be completely idiosyncratic to North Korea and make it normal and explicable through the eyes of diplomats of fraternal countries. And then also to underscore persistent differences that makes North Korea actually pretty unique. And I was wondering if you can dwell on the second aspect beyond nationalism. If you were to take a country like North Korea and Albania during the Khrushchev era, I was wondering if you can sort of underscore, highlight the differences that that have some lessons for us for regime collapse or something like that later on.
Well, replying the first question, I may say that even if the optimal case, if we had access to North Korean documents, even these, I mean all of them, which is not possible even in the United States, even in that case, I am a bit skeptical whether we can get the whole picture from them, in the sense that, for the simple fact that I strongly suspect that many instructions were given only in orally, for the simple fact that it was safer to do so, and for various reasons. For example, somehow I have a feeling that it is a bit overly optimistic to hope that we will ever get documents that we say, okay, this or that high-ranking official gives the instruction, okay, please turn off the electricity of this embassy for 2 days, or please don't give them the fish what they want, and when you finally reply after 2 months, give them goldfish instead. So I guess that this kind of instructions, no matter how important they were not documented in written form, or possibly they were, but I am not sure. So we always have this problem, and what we can do is to somehow reconstruct the way in which the North Korean leaders were thinking, because there were some kind of persistent patterns in their psychology. And in a sense, they used methods from the 1970s, which they used again and again and again. Just the purpose was different, but the logic was often similar. For example, that you pretend that you have a conflict with this power in order to get the support and friendship of the other. Just to mention an example, that when they wanted to get something from the Soviets, they sometimes pretended that they had some conflict with China. And the Soviets were so happy that finally the North Koreans realized the perfidious nature of Chinese foreign policy, that they immediately became friendly, although the North Koreans just fooled them. So, but after you saw the same method repeated several times, then again, if you see some unusual, then you have a kind of possibility of recognizing what they are doing. The most effective way, I think, is always to look for unusual elements, because almost nothing happened accidentally and incidentally. So if they did something which looks unreasonable, there must have a reason. But of course, we cannot explain everything, and these documents are not as good as Russian documents, and Russian documents are not as good as Chinese ones. So, replying to the second question, may you summarize it again?
The uniqueness.
Well, exactly. Now I remember. Well, to mention one example it's again a kind of psychological characteristic. The North Korean diplomacy, to put it in a rather subjective way, was much more rational and calculating than what the Albanians did from the 1960s on. That means, just look what the Albanians did. First, they broke with Tito, all right. It was a choice for the better, the bigger one. Then they broke with Khrushchev and allied themselves with China. Then they broke with China without normalizing the relationship with the Soviet Union. So in a sense, first they tried to force China not to have a rapprochement with the United States. When they more or less predictably failed in that, then they decided that they only knew how to have a correct ideological way and all the others are wrong. So the North Koreans never did something like this. If they had conflict with some power, they were usually very clever to turn to some other way, instead of having a conflict with both at the same time. So the Albanians had a more emotional approach. They resented very much how they were treated by the bigger communist powers, and all the others were bigger, of course. And so they lacked this kind of long-term calculating planning. The North Koreans, I think, were much more similar to the Chinese and Vietnamese in this sense for rather obvious cultural reasons. I think if the North Koreans were unique, which is really difficult to say in a sense because they had so many parallels with others, not with one at the same time, but sometimes with this or that. It's a kind of absolute suspicion of their own population and of the outside environment. I found some remarks made by North Korean leaders which I found absolutely unique about the unreliability of the political unreliability of the North Korean population. So this I found really strange, that how a regime can conclude that more than 15 years after establishing power and subjecting the population to a very rigorous political control, they can conclude that the new generations, which they themselves educated, they should be re-educated again because they don't have the right approach and things like that. So I think this was very unique in North Korea. And it was a result of a lot of factors, as Catherine told. But in general, if I really wanted to define this uniqueness, it would take so long that I cannot do it right now. But I would be very happy to discuss it with you at any time.
Okay. Tom Schwartz?
Tom Schwartz, I'm here at the Wilson Center as a public policy scholar. I'd like to ask you to expand perhaps with the differences and contrasts between the North Koreans and the Vietnamese during this time, since in a sense there's parallel situations, struggles for unification, aspects of how to deal with the United States, these sorts of things. I'm wondering what sorts of differences and contrasts you see, differences and similarities, I should say, with that in that situation.
I think that one of the greatest differences was that the Vietnamese always could feel that if they persist, then they can achieve victory. First, they managed to defeat the French, and it was very clear that they believed that they can defeat the Americans, and they did succeed. And one of the reasons why they could believe so, and they were right in that always there remained a strong communist movement in South Vietnam. In Korea, it was very different from 1949 on. As Bruce Cummings described in his book very detailed, the South Korean communist movement was completely stamped out by Lee Sin-man and the Americans by the end of the Korean War, but already its back was broken years before. So after it, Kim Il-sung got into a really difficult situation in the sense that he wanted to unify Korea as much as the Vietnamese and the Chinese leaders wanted. But he had a much more difficult task than any of the others. Because, you know, if you have the mainland and you face only Taiwan, you can isolate Taiwan diplomatically. Just you have to get a rapprochement with the United States. Because eventually the Americans will conclude that it's better to have good relationship with such a huge country than prefer the small island to all the others. Also in Vietnam, they had the chance of undermining South Vietnamese regime and defeat America. But in Korea, the situation was so complicated that they faced a country which was bigger than theirs, which gradually became economically more prosperous than theirs, and where there was no strong communist movement anymore after the Korean War. So it was a kind of frustration that they wanted to achieve the same so badly, but at the same time it was impossible for them to achieve. So in East Germany, they eventually recognized that it was not possible. For North Korea, this recognition came only by the late 80s, and they strove persistently for a long time, even though they could have realized that the South Korean population was not supporting this idea enough. So the other thing is that in Vietnam, the political situation never became so repressive than in North Korea. There were a lot of measures of repression. So we cannot have a kind of national characteristic approach or regime characteristic approach that always one was better than the others. But still that in Vietnam you didn't have this kind of almost linear progress that one leader after the other is marginalized and then purged. There were conflicts and there were purges, but not this kind of unilateral progression until the absolute dominance of a certain group and leader, which I think was interlocked by the issue of unification. So the Vietnamese didn't have this kind of absolute suspicion toward the other communist countries, at least for a time. But at the same time, I think there was an interesting parallel, that if we look at the emergence of a new leadership generation in Vietnam, not actually a new leadership generation, more a group in the 1960s, then we can see a parallel. Because no matter what outside external observers usually believed, by the early 1960s, Ho Chi Minh was no longer in control in Vietnamese policies as much as it was believed at the time. It was another group of leaders, most notably Le Duc Tho, Le Duan and others, who had the real power. And if we compare the background and worldview of these leaders with that of Kim Il-sung, there were rather interesting parallels. First of all, these Vietnamese leaders never spent any long period abroad. Ho Chi Minh did, some other Vietnamese leader did. They lived in France or in Russia, Soviet Union or in China. But the other leaders, they always spent most of their life, actually all of their life, in Vietnam itself. And it's the same true was for Kim Il-sung groups in the sense that they were technically not in Korea itself, but in Manchuria, but they still lived in a Korean environment, and they were involved in a national struggle against the Japanese. So for them, the culture or interest of other countries was certainly secondary or even lower in their preferences. They didn't care much about it. And so they had actual suspicion toward them and toward other Korean or Vietnamese leaders who had too much contact with other powers. It was a kind of parochial worldview, and also these people were usually not highly educated in comparison with Ho Chi Minh or other leaders of the Korean communist movement, which again influenced them to have a rather rigid approach. This kind of approach which I felt in the case of Le Duan, that you think in 24 hours of the day about revolution. You always have this mind and you don't smile. You always have this very rigid approach. It was very different from that of Ho Chi Minh. So this is how I may summarize it.
Okay, thank you, Balash. We have time for one more question.
Ken Quinones had his hand up.
Yes, right here. Why don't we collect two last questions, and then Balash can answer them both.
Thank you. My name is Mike Miyazawa. Within the time frame of your study of North Korea this time around, from 1953 to 64, did you find any sign or root or origin that suggests or relates to their nuclear weapons program? If yes, their motivation, their objective, the source of the technology, and so on.
Okay, and also over here.
Yes, Ken Quinones, thank you. Given your emphasis on nationalism, do you see any role for ideology as a motive for decision making, or was it primarily rationalization for decisions?
May you repeat this question a bit?
Yes. You've emphasized nationalism as a factor in decision making during the Kim Il-sung period. Did ideology, the shared ideology of communism, function as an excuse, an explanation for decisions, or was it occasionally a motivation for decisions?
Yeah. Fortunately, I don't have to reply to the first question because the Cold War International Historical Project Bulletin will soon publish an article about the North Korean nuclear program, to which I also contributed an article. So I described what I know about it in detail, and all what we have to do is to wait until its publication. With regard to the second question, I think that ideology was certainly not just a rationalization. It was taken seriously in the sense that Kim Il-sung was maybe not sure what is needed to be done or what is acceptable in ideological sense, but he knew pretty well what he found unacceptable, which was out of the question, and certainly in the sense that he was rather rigidly attached to this model of absolute state control over economy and society. This was something which he must have, found in the ideology of communism, that if you have an economic policy, it must be controlled by the state in any sense. Even if there were some tendencies in the policies of pre-colonial Korean kingdom, it was never done to that level of top-down absolute control, to the level of the rural population. So in this sense, I think he was certainly very much influenced by the idea. I mentioned in one of the footnotes of my book that there were a lot of third world leaders who were experimenting with a kind of socialism like Arab socialism or African socialism. But no one of them had this kind of absolute state control over economy and society than the real communist systems. So I think this mattered. In other ways, I think it did not matter as much. Even Juche itself was not treated in the same way internally than externally. They could be rather pragmatic. And I just mentioned as a last example to, how can I say, how he used ideology and how the East European diplomats who were familiar with the theory of Marxism, how they were baffled and outraged by this use of terms, was that when in the 1970s Kim Il-sung declared, and this slogan was repeated endlessly, that rice is communism, I think Marx would have been turned in his grave.
Thank you, Bawash. Let me just thank all of you for coming. Just end with a couple of closing notes. One is to tell you that books are for sale outside on your way out, so please feel free to follow up on this session by delving in. And second, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Cold War International History Project, but to you and everyone else, please check the Cold War Project website for announcements of the next in the series of talks that the project sponsors, and also for announcements of publications. So with that, thank you for coming, and join me in thanking our speakers.
So finally, I would like to say that because we had no time for answering all the possible questions, so if anyone else has some question, I would be very happy to respond in a more informal way, either today or some other occasion. Through, for example.
One question about Hungarian Vietnamese relations in 66-67 in connection to my book. Hungary plays a role in the story that I'm telling, in particular, for example, the Hungarian, the HSWP Congress in late November, early December 66. Do you have any records of those conversations with your delegation? I think Rudapro leads it, but it's a very key moment.
60 what?
66. Late 66. I'm very interested in that, and also if you have located what no one else has found, which is records of Janos Peter's visits to Hanoi, either in fall 65 or fall 66. Anyway, we can be in email touch. Are you continuing to work on that now? Vietnam?
I think I have seen most of the documents from this period which were in the foreign ministry files. So I will check it, but the only problem is that I won't spend much time in Hungary. Now I go back, then I have to go to Romania and back
to Romania?
Yeah. No, there will be just a conference there for the Soros Foundation. So what I would like to ask you then,